All right. Ready to dive into some security assessments today.
Yeah.
We're talking everything, risk assessments, we'll get into penetration testing, all that good stuff.
Right, right.
And I think, a lot of times people think this is just about checking a box, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we really want, by the end of this deep dive, we really want you to be able to kind of
Yeah.
walk away and be able to assess your organization's security
For sure.
and understand what you really need.
Yeah, and I think, what's fascinating to me is that so many companies I talk to, they just think a scan is enough.
Right.
They're like, oh yeah, we do a scan every year. We're good. It's like putting on your nice alarm system.
Right.
But you're leaving the back door wide open.
Oh, wow.
You really...
Yeah, so no shortcuts then.
There are no shortcuts when it comes to security.
Oh.
Okay, I like it. I like it.
And I think the thing that's important that I really like to highlight is understanding the difference between all these different types of assessments.
Okay.
Because it can get confusing.
Yeah.
We have vulnerability assessments, we have penetration tests, we have risk assessments.
Right.
And they all kind of play together, but they're very different.
Okay.
So if you're a company, let's say you're a company that handles a lot of PII data, really sensitive data, you might think, oh, I need a vulnerability scan. Well, a vulnerability scan is one thing.
Right.
But what you really might need is a penetration test.
Okay.
Where you're having ethical hackers come in and actually try to break into your systems.
So like simulating an actual attack.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's one thing to say, oh, there's a vulnerability, you have a door unlocked.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing to say, I can actually walk through that door. I can get into your network. That's the difference.
Gotcha. So vulnerability scan, checking the doors are locked, penetration test, like trying to pick the lock.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, now I think that's a good distinction. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears for a second because
Sure.
I think before we even get into the tools and doing the assessments and stuff, there's all this documentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Policies, procedures, all that fun stuff.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah. So
The documentation side of it.
let's talk about that. Like, what do people need to know, and why is that even important?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to kind of establish what we call the hierarchy of security documents and how they all kind of play together.
Okay.
So you have policies, and policies are kind of your overarching, this is how we're going to do security.
Okay.
These are the principles we're going to follow.
So it's like the what?
The what, exactly.
Like, okay.
So if we're talking about a mobile device policy, you might have a policy that says all company data on mobile devices needs to be encrypted.
Right.
That's your policy.
Gotcha.
Then you get into your standards.
Okay, so that's the how.
Exactly, that's the how.
Okay.
So your standard might say, okay, well, you need to be using AES 256-bit encryption.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it gets very specific.
Gotcha.
Then you have your guidelines, which are more recommendatory. They might say, hey, make sure you're choosing strong passwords. Make sure you're enabling remote wipe, things like that.
Okay.
And then finally, you have procedures,
Okay.
which are the step-by-step. Here's how you enroll your device in MDM. Here's how you, set up your email.
So it's like building a house, right? You need the blueprint, but then you need the actual
Exactly.
building codes, and then you need the how-to step.
Exactly, exactly. And then you have the inspector that comes in and makes sure you followed all the codes.
Right, and that's kind of like the assessment, I guess.
That's the assessment, exactly.
Okay.
Because you can have all these policies and procedures, but if you're not following them,
Right.
it's pointless.
It doesn't really...
It's just paperwork.
Right, it's all for show.
Yeah, okay. And unfortunately, a lot of companies, they're either non-existent, these documents, or they're all over the place. They're outdated.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They don't reflect the current environment.
Yeah, or they're just cobbled together from...
Exactly.
toe.
And then they get audited. They're like, oh, we need to prove that we're doing all this. And it's like, well, you don't have the documentation to prove it.
Right. It's a disaster waiting to happen. So
Exactly.
I guess the big takeaway there is before we even get into the fancy tools and everything, we need to make sure we have
Absolutely.
our house in order, so to speak.
I love that analogy, the house in order.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let's assume we've got our house in order. Let's say we've got all these documents. We kind of know what we're doing. Now we want to actually get into how do we assess this? What are the tools that we can use?
Yeah, and the good news is you don't need to spend a ton of money to get started.
Okay.
There are a lot of basic tools that are, free, open source, very affordable, especially for smaller businesses.
Okay, let's talk about those. So what are some of those?
Yeah, so when we talk about affordable, let's talk about spreadsheets.
Okay, yeah. Everybody loves a good spreadsheet.
Exactly. Right. You'd be surprised how much you can do with a spreadsheet, especially if you're, a smaller organization and you're just getting started with risk assessments.
Right. So like listing out our assets and then the threats and all that.
Exactly. You can list your assets, you can list your threats, your vulnerabilities,
Okay.
you can put in formulas to calculate your risk scores, you can start to prioritize
How nice.
your mitigation efforts.
It's like that first step to kind of wrapping your head around
Exactly.
everything you've got.
Exactly. It's all about working smarter, not harder, right?
Right.
I actually worked with a company. It was a small business, and that's all we did.
Oh, wow.
We used a spreadsheet. We customized it for their environment,
Okay.
and they were able to take their risk um, posture or their security posture from kind of unknown to actually understanding. Here are our top risks.
Right.
Here's what we need to do about it, and they actually implemented some cost-effective controls and really, really improved their security
Just from that.
just from a spreadsheet.
That's amazing. I love it. I love a good spreadsheet success story.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I imagine, spreadsheets are great, but at some point you probably hit a wall, right?
You do, you do.
And you need some more advanced tools. So
Exactly.
what are some of the things that people can start looking at once they've outgrown the spreadsheet?
Right. So as your organization grows, your security needs are going to get more complex.
Right.
So you might have compliance requirements.
Right.
If you're dealing with, controlled unclassified information, you might have, you might need to comply with NIST standards,
Right.
things like that. So there are tools out there. One that I like to mention is OpenFISMA.
Okay, I've heard of FISMA. What
Yeah.
is Open FISMA?
So OpenFISMA is essentially a set of guidelines and tools to help organizations, specifically that I think it's geared towards federal agencies,
Okay.
manage their security and privacy risks.
Okay.
So it's think of it as like a security assessment starter kit, for lack of a better word,
Okay.
but it's tailored for government compliance.
Gotcha.
So it helps you implement the controls and the documentation you need to meet those requirements.
So it's like having a consultant in a box that can kind of
Exactly.
help you with that.
And guide you through the process.
Okay.
Another tool, and we've talked about this, or we mentioned it earlier, CIS Cat Lite.
Right. CIS Catlight. Yeah.
So this is a great tool. It's free,
Okay.
and it basically allows you to check your systems for configuration weaknesses based on those CIS benchmarks that we talked about.
Right. So those are kind of like those detailed checklists almost of
Exactly.
security best practices.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So CIS Cat Lite is like your automated auditor
Gotcha.
that will go through and say, hey, you're deviating from the benchmark here, here, and here.
Okay.
So it's one thing to think you have a secure system. It's another thing to know you have a secure system.
Yeah.
And this will help you get there.
So this is different than a vulnerability scanner, like a Nessus or something like that.
Yeah. So a vulnerability scanner, like a Nessus, it's going to look for known vulnerabilities.
Right.
It's going to
Right.
scan your systems and say, hey, I found this vulnerability. It's got the CDE number. You need to patch it. CIS Cat is more about configuration.
Okay.
So it might not flag a system that has, weak password requirements as a vulnerability,
Okay.
but CIS Cat will, because it's not following best practices.
Gotcha. So it's
Configuration is the hardening.
okay. I like it.
So those are a couple of tools that you can use, and they can be very effective. And again, they're either free or very low cost.
Right. And I think that's a good point to emphasize is that, you don't have to spend a ton of money
No, you go.
to get going with this stuff.
Exactly. Exactly.
I want to shift gears for a second and talk about a tool because you mentioned this to me offline, and I'm very curious about this one because it sounds kind of scary in a way, but also really interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's Hashcat.
Hashcat. Yeah.
So tell me about Hashcat. What is it?
So Hashcat is it's a password cracking tool.
Okay.
It's very powerful,
Okay.
and it's used by both good guys and bad guys.
Right.
But we use it ethically,
Of course.
right? We're not using it to break into other people's systems. We're using it to assess our own security.
So it's like an internal tool to see kind of how vulnerable you are.
Exactly. So if you want to know how strong your passwords are,
Okay.
Hashcat is a great tool for that.
So walk me through that. How does that actually work?
So essentially what you do is you take your password hashes
Okay.
and you feed them into Hashcat.
Okay.
And Hashcat will use various techniques to try to crack those passwords.
Okay, and these are like known techniques that
Known techniques, yeah, these are techniques that the bad guys are using.
Right.
So we're simulating a real-world attack,
Gotcha.
but we're doing it in a safe environment.
Right, so you're basically putting your passwords through a crash test to see what happens.
Exactly. And what's interesting is, you know, a lot of times we'll find that passwords are not as strong as people think they are.
Yeah, I bet.
You know, we've done assessments where we've cracked, you know, a significant percentage of passwords
Really?
in a matter of, hours or even minutes. So it's really eye-opening.
So, like, what are some of the, I mean, I know you can't give away all the secrets, but like, what are some of the things that make a password vulnerable to something like Hashcat?
Sure. So, common passwords are obviously a big one.
Right, like password 123.
Exactly. Password 123, let me 123456.
Right, right.
Those are going to be cracked very quickly.
Oh.
Another thing is password length.
Oh.
Shorter passwords are obviously easier to crack than longer passwords.
Okay.
And then the other thing is the character set.
Okay.
So if you're just using lowercase letters, that's going to be much easier to crack than if you're using uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols.
So it's really about like the complexity.
Complexity and length
Okay.
are the two big ones. And the other thing that Hashcat can do is it can leverage what we call word lists and rules.
Okay.
So there are these massive lists out there of common passwords.
Right.
And Hashcat can use those to try to crack passwords.
So it's almost like a dictionary attack, but on steroids?
Exactly.
Okay, wow, that's powerful stuff.
It is powerful stuff, but again, used ethically.
Right, right.
It's a great tool to help us improve our security.
Yeah, it's like, you need to know your enemy.
Exactly.
Right? And what they're capable of.
Yeah.
So you can defend against it.
Exactly.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting tool to be aware of.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the human element of this for a second, because
Yeah.
I think, we've talked about tools, we've talked about, documentation, but at the end of the day, like, this all comes down to people, right?
It does. It all comes down to people and communication.
Right. So how do you coordinate something like this? Because it's not just a one-person job.
No, it's definitely not a one-person job.
Right. There's a lot of people involved. So how do you make sure everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and it's something that we stress a lot is the importance of communication.
Right.
You can have the best tools, you can have the best methodology, but if you're not communicating effectively, it's all for nothing.
All going to fall apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, it starts with identifying your stakeholders, right? Who are the people that are going to be involved in this assessment?
Right.
It's going to be IT staff. It's going to be system administrators. It might be application owners. It might even be end users, depending on the scope of the assessment.
Right.
And then it's about, making sure that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities.
So kind of like assembling the team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Assembling the team, making sure everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. Who to contact if something goes wrong.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then, throughout the assessment, it's important to have clear communication channels.
Okay.
If an issue is discovered, who do you report that to?
Right. Right.
What is the escalation path?
Okay.
Things like that.
So you don't want to discover something, and then it's like, well, who do I tell?
Exactly. Who do I tell?
Yeah.
What do I do with this information?
All right. Right.
So those are all really important things to consider.
Okay. So communication. Communication
Communication is key.
I like it.
And then the other thing, and you touched on this, is having an incident response plan.
Right.
Because, things happen, right?
Yeah.
We do these assessments. We try to be as careful as possible, but sometimes we might uncover something that it causes a problem.
Right. Or something could happen.
Exactly.
That's completely unrelated.
Exactly.
Right. And you just want to make sure you're prepared for anything.
Exactly. So having that incident response plan in place,
Right.
so that if something does happen, everyone knows what to do.
Okay, so it's like that fire drill, right?
It's exactly like a fire drill.
You don't want to wait until there's a fire to figure out
sure.
where the fire extinguisher is.
Exactly. So yeah, those are some of the key things to think about from a coordination and communication standpoint.
Okay, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize because, we we can get so caught up in the technical details of this stuff, but at the end of the day, like, security is a human problem, right?
It is a human problem.
It's not just about the technology, it's about the people.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about the people, it's about the processes, it's about the culture.
Right.
And if you don't have those things in place,
Right.
the technology is not going to save you.
Right. It's like, the best lock in the world doesn't matter if someone's just going to leave the door open.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Mhm.
100%. All right. I think that's a good point to kind of transition to the next topic, which is, we're going through this assessment. We're gathering all this information.
Right.
We're looking at vulnerabilities. We're looking at, all these different things. But we're also gathering a lot of data.
Yes. A lot of data.
Right. And some of this data is very sensitive.
Very sensitive.
Right. So how do we make sure that we're handling that data responsibly?
Yeah. And that's a great question because, we're talking about system configurations. We're talking about user accounts.
Right.
We might even be talking about, sensitive customer information,
Right. Depending on
depending on the scope of the assessment.
the type of assessment. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we need to make sure that we're handling that data responsibly. And that starts with understanding what data we're collecting,
Yeah.
why we're collecting it, and what we're going to do with it.
Okay.
And then it's about implementing the appropriate security controls
Right. So it's not just about like finding the vulnerabilities. It's about protecting
and protecting the data.
the data that you're gathering.
Exactly.
Okay. So how do we do that?
So I like to break it down into kind of 4 key areas.
Okay.
We have collection,
Okay.
we have storage,
Okay.
we have transmission,
Oh.
and we have destruction.
Okay. So it's like the life cycle of the data.
The life cycle of the data. Exactly.
All right, let's break those down. So let's start with collection. What are some of the things we need to think about there? All right, let's break those down. So let's start with collection. What are some of the things we need to think about there?
So with collection, I always say what less is more. We only want to collect the data that we absolutely need for that assessment.
Okay, so don't go overboard, just get what you need.
Exactly. If you don't need it, don't collect it.
Makes sense. And then storage, what do we do with the data once we have it?
Storage, encryption is your best friend.
Okay.
Encrypt that data, protect it. Think of it like, you have this data, it's in a safe. Encryption is that combination
Gotcha.
that prevents anybody from getting in, even if they get their hands on the data.
Right. So even if like, laptop gets stolen or something, they still can't get to it.
Exactly. It's just gibberish without that key.
Okay. I like it. What about transmission?
So transmission, think secure channels.
Okay.
If we're moving data around, we're using encrypted email, we're using VPNs,
Right.
we're using, secure file transfer services.
So, like, putting it on a thumb drive and walking it across the street or...
No thumb drives, no.
Okay, good.
We want to make sure that that data is protected in transit.
Right. It's like, transporting something valuable. Right.
Exactly.
We
Exactly.
want to make sure it's protected the whole way.
You got it.
Okay, and then finally, destruction.
Destruction. So, when we're done with the data,
Yeah.
we need to get rid of it,
Okay.
and we need to get rid of it securely. So, no deleting and then throwing it in the recycling bin. We're talking
Right.
secure dilution methods,
Yeah.
data wiping software if we have to, physical destruction of hard drives.
Oh, wow. Okay, so like the hard drive gets smashed or something?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes that's what it takes.
Wow. Okay, so we take data destruction seriously.
Very seriously. That data is sensitive,
Yeah.
and we need to make sure it's gone.
Okay, I like it. So we've talked about the tools, we've talked about the coordination, the communication, all of that. We've got all this data, we've done all this work. At the end of the day, we got to kind of report on this.
Okay, yeah.
So talk to me about the report. Like what makes a good security assessment report?
So a good security assessment report, it tells a story,
Right.
right? It's not just a data dump. It's not just, here's all the technical findings. It's about taking those findings
Right.
and translating them into something that everybody can understand.
Right, because not everyone's super technical. Right.
Exactly. And even if they are technical, they might not be aware of the business impact
Right.
of those findings. So we need to connect those dots for them.
So it's not just about, hey, you have a cross-site scripting vulnerability. It's like, here's what that means, and here's how it can be used against you.
Exactly. And here's what's going to happen if it's exploited.
Right.
Wow.
You
You could lose customer data.
Yeah.
You could have financial losses, regulatory fines.
Right, you could be
Mhm.
on the front page of the newspaper.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Not good.
So we want to kind of lay it all out there, but in a way that's understandable and actionable, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's about empowering our clients to make informed decisions
Right.
about their security.
Right. So not just like scaring them.
No, we don't want to scare them.
Right, but giving them the information they need to actually fix things.
Exactly. We want them to understand the risks so they can take the appropriate steps to mitigate those risks.
Okay, so it's kind of like that fine line between, being honest and transparent,
Yes,
but also being helpful.
absolutely.
Right. And I imagine that takes some finesse.
It does. It takes finesse, it takes experience,
Right.
and it takes really understanding your audience.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so we've got our report. We've done all this work. We've given them our recommendations. What's next? Where do we go from here?
So this is where that concept of continuous improvement comes in.
Okay.
Right. This isn't just a one-time thing.
Right.
We want to make sure that we're constantly evaluating our security posture.
Okay.
We're constantly looking for ways to improve.
So it's not just like we did the assessment, we're good.
Exactly.
It's like, okay, we did the assessment. Now how do we keep getting better?
Exactly. How do we take this information and actually improve our security program?
Right. So it's an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing journey.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I like it.
And there are frameworks out there that can help guide us on that journey. One that I like to reference is NIST Special Publication 800-115.
Okay, so that's a mouthful. What is that?
So NIST 800-115, it's essentially a set of guidelines for building a solid security assessment program.
Okay.
And it really helps organizations establish a repeatable process
Okay.
for doing these assessments. So it's not just, we're going to do an assessment every year and hope for the best. It's no, we're going to have a plan.
Okay.
We're going to have a process. We're going to follow these steps.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like a roadmap in a way, right?
Exactly. It's a roadmap for continuous improvement,
Okay.
and it helps organizations mature their security posture over time.
I like so it's not just about like checking boxes. It's
Mhm.
about actually like getting better at security.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's about building a culture of security.
I like it. Listen, this has been a fantastic deep dive.
Yeah.
I feel like we've really gone pretty deep on security
We
assessment.
did. We covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that we missed that you think is really important for folks to know?
I think that the key takeaway here is, security is a journey. It's not a destination.
Okay.
And it's something that we need to constantly be thinking about, constantly be improving. And the more we can do that, the better off we're all going to be.
Words to live by. Words to live by. All right. Well, listen. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
This has been great. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into security assessments.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Until next time, stay curious, stay secure.